Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are diving into a massive psychological mystery. Why exactly do audiences form such fierce, enduring bonds with polarizing alternative media figures? It's a phenomenon that's completely shaping our modern culture, yet so much of it happens entirely invisibly, right inside our own minds. To figure this out, we aren't going to critique the media itself. Instead, we're going to look at some fascinating academic research about what actually happens in the brain of the viewer long after the screen goes dark. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the information war ecosystem, define parasocial relationships, break down the attributes of imagined interactions, see how they predict credibility and views, and finally unpack echo chambers and hate watching. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The information war ecosystem. So we're living in an era where the old lines of traditional news are just completely blurred. What actually happens when mass media collides with a landscape full of conspiracy theories? What really draws a viewer to controversial broadcasts? The core mystery we're tackling in this explainer is the unseen, internal mechanics that make people believe and keep returning to alternative media. To understand this, we're focusing on the highly polarizing show InfoWars, hosted by Alex Jones. To solve this, we're diving into some fascinating peer-reviewed research from the Southwestern Mass Communication Journal. Researchers T. Philip Madison, Emily N. Covington, Caitlin Wright, and Timothy Gaspard took a completely neutral approach here, analyzing an audience sample of 584 people. And their goal wasn't to judge the content itself. Instead, they wanted to map out the internal, psychological reactions of the people who actually consume it.
All right, Section 2, Defining Parasocial Relationships.
Okay, so parasocial relationships, or PSRs for short. Basically, these are the one-sided bonds we form with media personalities. They obviously lack the real-world back and forth, but emotionally, they often feel exactly like the relationship you might have with a good neighbor. But here's the wild part. These relationships absolutely do not end when the broadcast is over. They actually stick around to grow in our minds.
And how do they grow? Through what researchers call imagined interactions. Think of it as a really functional type of daydreaming. The crucial point here is that viewers are continuing to interact with media hosts long after the episode wraps, entirely through internal monologues. You're literally in your head actively rehearsing scenarios, having debates, and running through conversations with these figures.
And to be clear, the researchers didn't just survey some tiny fringe group. They looked at a super diverse, real-world cross-section. Out of the people surveyed, 46% were Democrats, 30% Republicans, plus a mix of libertarians, Greens, and independents. So this kind of psychological daydreaming, it's not a partisan thing at all. It's just a deeply human mechanism.
Moving on to Section 3, Attributes of Imagined Interactions.
Now, the researchers pinned down 5 distinct variables that explain exactly how we mentally engage in these one-sided relationships. You've got frequency, which is how often they pop into your head, variety, the different people or places in your imagination, valence, whether the daydream is a positive or negative experience. But today, we're going to zero in on the 2 biggest game changers, specificity and self-dominance. Let's start with specificity. This measures how incredibly vivid, sensory, and detailed the imaginary scenario is in your mind. When you're having this mental interaction with a host, can you picture the exact shirt they're wearing? Can you hear their specific catchphrases or visualize their facial expressions? Basically, the sharper and more realistic the mental movie is, the higher the specificity. On the flip side, we have self-dominance. This looks at who is actually controlling that mental conversation. Are you just sitting there quietly listening to the host in your head, or are you the one doing all the talking, arguing, and directing? Interestingly enough, Americans tend to score really high on self-dominance in their imagined interactions, which makes a lot of sense since it's heavily driven by our individualistic cultural values.
This brings us to Section 4, Predicting Credibility and Views.
All right, let's look at variety first. Surprisingly, the data reveals that if you have a wide variety of other voices, people, and places floating around in your head during these daydreams, you actually find the host significantly less credible. Why is that? Well, bringing in a diversity of viewpoints into your imagination acts like a buffer. It completely dilutes the perceived credibility of just one highly opinionated host.
But here is the absolute golden predictor: specificity. Highly detailed mental imagery heavily drives both how much you believe the host and how often you tune in. If you can clearly visualize their exact mannerisms and quotes, you are deeply locked in. But on the other hand, self-dominance actually makes the host seem less believable. If you're dominating the imaginary conversation, you're probably lecturing them or disagreeing with them in your mind, which naturally lowers their credibility. When we look at the regression analysis, check this out. Frequency actually has almost zero correlation. Just thinking about a host all the time doesn't mean you'll watch them more or automatically believe what they say. But valence, meaning the daydreams are actually pleasant, and specificity, meaning they're super detailed, those are the true engines of audience loyalty. Happy, crystal clear imaginations, that equals dedicated viewership.
And finally, Section 5, echo chambers and hate watching. Remember how dominating the mental conversation makes the host less credible to you? Well, the researchers tied this to a really fascinating phenomenon, hate watching. People will intentionally consume media they absolutely despise, literally just to argue with the host in their head. Doing this constantly feeds their own sense of moral or intellectual superiority. They aren't watching to get informed, they're watching to win an imaginary argument. But here is the real danger. Whether a viewer is completely agreeing with a host through detailed, positive daydreams, or just hate watching to feel superior, the end result is pretty much exactly the same. These parasocial dynamics push viewers to retreat into isolated echo chambers. They shut themselves off from the actual marketplace of ideas, choosing the comfort of their own constructed mental relationships where they can feel safely separated from the rest of the so-called bewildered herd. Which brings us to our big takeaway. As we navigate this incredibly polarized media landscape, it's so easy to just blame the screens or the algorithms or the hosts themselves. But the science is telling us to look inward. We really have to ask ourselves, how is our own functional daydreaming silently shaping our reality, our beliefs, and our society? Think about the media figures you're interacting with in your own mind today, and ask yourself, who is actually writing the script? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.